Hello, this presentation today is on the idea that Christianity and religion are in opposition to science. But that is actually a myth. The English word science actually comes from the Latin word for knowledge, which was scientia. So science means knowledge, simply knowledge. Sorry, skip slide. They're actually amongst people who know anything at all about the history of science, which is actually not many of us. Amongst the ones who know anything at all, we may believe some myths. So those who know may think that the Greeks were the first to try and study the natural world and the physical environment, but actually they were not. People had always studied the physical environment throughout history, all over the world, different nations and groups of people. So, so the Chinese and the Islamic people and all these different peoples around the world tried to study the physical environment to figure out how to use it and harness it. And there's another myth that for a very long time after the ancient Greeks, there was no science and there was only religion until Galileo in the late Renaissance in the 1600s. Actually, that's also another myth. So obviously investigations into the physical environment was ongoing. They were ongoing and it never ended, and people always wanted to know and understand the physical environment. And actually it was a prerogative within the first scientists of the Latin culture in Europe, Christian scientists from the church. It was a prerogative to know and understand the physical environment. And so, so the study of the scientia of the physical environment, it used to actually be religious. It started within the Latin European church, but then it branched off and split from the church gradually over the Age of the Enlightenment. So this was, the time when in the Enlightenment naturalism and materialism was exploding, and people they were believing increasingly in the physical only naturalism, that concept, and also now when we look at history, there are many historical revisionists who say that Galileo was the cause, the Galileo affair, in which he was imprisoned for saying planets revolved around the sun, and that was the cause of a split of scientists from the church. But actually, there was just a gradual split over the Enlightenment. There was just a gradual explosion of science over the Enlightenment, and the scientific community branched off. And so there's this ongoing false dichotomy that the church objects to science, and that studying the physical environment is at odds with any religion and at odds with Christianity and at odds with the church. But actually that is false. As we can see, science came from the church. It came from medieval Christian Europe and all of the clergy of that time, who dedicated all these resources to studying science. And all of the advances within secular science that we can see from the Enlightenment age onwards, and all of the 19th century advances in science, that was actually supported. Secular science was supported by the branching away from the church, which was caused by supposed conflict. The conflict, whether or not it actually occurred between science and the church, I think that's very debatable, because the church really did invest everything in science. But anyway, the branching off produced many advances and explosive advances in secular science that we have today. Yeah, and it was Christians, early clergymen in the European church, who used modes of logic from Aristotle to systematize how we study the physical world and what we called natural philosophy. And that made today what we know as modern science. So they, uh, in their time, science was blossoming in the Islamic world, and there was the science of the early Greek fathers that they combined, to try and systematize this study of science. And I recommend some YouTube lectures by Jakob Basigin at the University of Toronto about the history and philosophy of science to understand this a bit more. Also, some popular myths about the history of science. Sorry, my dog is just upset. My husband's outside. Yeah, just a bit inconvenient, sorry. So anyway, there are some popular myths about the history of science that Jakob Basigin came up, that Jakob Basigin put in a slide in his lectures, which I copied here. Science did not begin in the 17th century, top left, with Galileo and Newton. Galileo was not a martyr of science who fought against the church, who disliked science. That was false. Both of those things are false. And it's believed in science today that God does not exist, that everyone who works in science is an atheist. That's incorrect. And the period called the Scientific Revolution, the second half of the Renaissance of 100 years, that revolution was a thing that liberated science away from religion. That's also false, because the Scientific Revolution, it was a revolution in terms of scientific methods within all the scientists of the Christian church. All the scientists of Europe were Christian, they belonged to the church, and the revolution was in their methods and their ideas and theories. So yes, these are some popular myths that Jakob Basigin put in his lecture. Now, the natural world has been studied for a very, very long time, up until the Renaissance in Europe. People have always studied the natural world. It was called natural philosophy, and as a part of this was one of the things called alchemy, which is the forefather of chemistry. And alchemy, the study of material sciences, has been around for 4,000 years. But alchemy was just not separate from, and it was studied in the context of the spiritual nature, believed to be the essential quality of the universe. So it was studied religiously. So as we can see in modern material sciences, the history of knowing about these certain materials come from a very long time ago. So people investigated gunpowder and how to make ice from endothermic reactions with different substances like salt. As we can see, the study of physics was advanced in architecture, like in the Middle Eastern architecture, in which they had to adapt many methods to make ice houses, like the yakhchal, and complicated aqueducts for agriculture. In such a dry, arid place like the desert, they had to make qanat. So they actually had to investigate physics deeply to understand how to harness their physical environment. But in terms of a center of chemistry and alchemy and dedicated study, that it was well known. So Egypt, when it was taken over by the Ptolemaic Greek kingdom in 305 BC, it became known as Hellenistic Egypt, like Greek Egypt. And the city of Alexandria in Egypt became the center of alchemy studies, and it remained the preeminent center throughout the Greek and Roman Empire periods. And then in Christian Europe, Christians began to study the natural world with extreme dedication, with like wholehearted devotion to it. So after the fall of the Roman Empire, Christians actually went to Spain and Sicily to retrieve Aristotle's works, and that was the beginning of the 12th century Renaissance. Yeah, and so basically, the church studying the natural philosophy, studying the physical environment, was actually made possible and made successful by the fact that in monotheism in Christianity, the confession of God, that He is a lawgiver, and He gives, then made it possible to understand that He is a lawgiver who created this world and therefore governs the world by laws, by intelligible laws, and that is known as the logos in Greek. So that made it very possible for the church and very successful for them to study science, natural philosophy. And so when Aristotle's works were brought back from Spain and Sicily at the start of the 12th century Renaissance, this Dominican Catholic friar called Thomas Aquinas adopted these Aristotelian principles, and he argued that human reasoning and faith are compatible and should be and can be pursued together. And then the theological world at that time started adapting to Aristotle's secular, like non-religious ideas. So Aristotle is a very old Greek philosopher. And so the church started using his secular, non-religious, but logical deduction techniques and philosophies. And also his writings about how reality is structured and how to study nature and the physical universe. And so that was very helpful to the church in studying natural philosophy, studying the environment. And at that time, in the 11th and 12th centuries, was when the church established universities. So they had cathedral schools, and they simply turned these cathedral schools, the church turned these cathedral schools into universities to study the world around them. Yeah, so Thomas Aquinas, his rationalistic views were being hotly debated in these newly established universities. So Bologna was established 1088, Oxford was established 1096, and the University of Paris was 1150. Yes. And then, yeah, the cathedral schools partially detached and became known as universities, detached from the church, but partially. And there's this book, The Foundations of Modern Science in the Middle Ages. The author, Edward Grant, says, contrary to prevailing opinion, the roots of modern science were planted in the ancient and medieval worlds long before the scientific revolution of the 17th century. Indeed, that revolution would have been inconceivable without the cumulative antecedent efforts of three great civilizations, Greek, Islamic, and Latin. With the scientific riches it derived from translation from Greco-Islamic sources in the 12th and 13th centuries, the Christian Latin civilization of Western Europe began the last leg of the intellectual journey that culminated in a scientific revolution that transformed the world. The factors that produced this unique achievement are found in the way Christianity developed in the West and in the invention of the university in 1200. As this 1997 study shows, it is no mere coincidence that the origins of modern science and the modern university occurred simultaneously in Western Europe during the late Middle Ages. So, this blurb from Edward Grant's book simply is saying that the scientific revolution in the Renaissance in the 17th century that produced things like the scientific method that we use today, that people know how to use in school, in high school. The scientific revolution actually would not have been possible without all of the roots sown in ancient and medieval studies of the world, studies of science. So the revolution would have been impossible without all of the cumulative efforts and works of the Greeks and the Islamics. And also the last leg of developing modern science was the works done by the Latin European Church, who, what they did was, they translated all these Greek and Islamic works of science in the 12th and 13th centuries. And then, as the Latin civilization of Europe, they created modern science in their studies of science, systematically combining all science up to that time, and also using Aristotelian deductive logic to create the scientific method, and inventing many measurement tools and equipment for the study of natural philosophy or science. And they invested so much, as the church did, sorry, it was the church, right, who did these things. They invested so much in the university for this end. Okay, and so during the Renaissance, there was this rise. So the Renaissance was from 1450 to 1650. Approximately, and in this time, in the latter half, was called the Scientific Revolution. And across the Renaissance, there were multiple huge things discovered, like Newton's study of gravity and the laws of motion, Copernicus and Galileo's model of the solar system, the planets and Earth revolving around the sun. And and then so in this period, with all of these things, coming out, these great pieces of knowledge coming out, then there was also the simultaneous rise of a few naturalists, so materialists, people who believed in matter alone and physical forces alone. But they were theistic naturalists. They believed in God. And so these materialists, their names were Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, just a few of them. And in the second half of the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, Copernicus published his work in 1543. Isaac Newton published his work in 1687. That's generally regarded as the boundaries of the Scientific Revolution. So Newton and Copernicus's publications. But basically this revolution was about drastic change in the scientific methods and theories of inquiry. And the scientific method was introduced and adopted in the world of science. And new equipment was invented, like telescopes and microscopes and barometers and the thermometer. And at the end of this period, there was this famous thing called the Galileo affair, in which this scientist Galileo, he had a model of heliocentrism, that Earth and planets revolve around the sun, and there was a rift about his studies, like about whether he was correct or not, in the scientific community and also within the church. And he was imprisoned as a result. But there's only a handful of people like his case amongst so many church scientists. So this really cannot, I don't think, but people say, in hindsight now, looking at the branching off of the scientific community during the Enlightenment, which came later, then people say it's historical revisionism to say that Galileo caused a split of science from the church, and that it was a symbol of conflict between church and science. But actually, as we can see, the church actually made science. Anyway, in the period after was the Age of Enlightenment, from 1685 to 1815, approximately, and so that followed the Renaissance and the Scientific Revolution. There are two naturalists from England. So one was 1651, Thomas Hobbes. He stated his case for materialism. David Hume stated his case in 1739. But actually, there were a number of French materialists who were hardline materialists, like La Mettrie. He presented a fully materialist and mechanistic view of men in this book called Man, a Machine. And D'Holbach wrote this infamous book called The System of Nature, which expressed an uncompromising materialist philosophy, which denied the existence of anything that couldn't be explained by observable operation of natural causes. So they were hardline materialists, like atheists, basically, which was kind of a first, because these prior naturalists from England, they were like theistic naturalists. But, as we can see with these, this is the next point, as we can see with these things, the scientific things come up with, the knowledge and inventions in the scientific revolution, that paved the way for naturalists, right? And the ideas of those naturalists that arose from Hume and Hobbes, and with those inventions of the scientific revolution, that paved the way for the Enlightenment age, French materialists, to come up with even more hardline materialism and works on materialism, which then, as you know, with the things discovered during the Enlightenment, together then pushed through to the next period, the 19th century, in which in the 19th century there was then finally a widespread adoption of this naturalistic worldview in the European intellectual class, because it had exploded in the Enlightenment age with those French philosophers, and and all of the inventions together with those French philosophers led to the adoption of the naturalistic worldview in the 19th century, and that also so basically, yes, the Renaissance studies of science of the physical environment led to the rise of materialism in the ideas of Hobbes. And then the advances in science during Hobbes's time and Hobbes's ideas then led to the explosion of French materialism and naturalism in the next period called the Enlightenment. And the inventions and knowledge of the Enlightenment and all of that explosion of naturalistic, materialistic French ideas, together, the knowledge and those ideas being spread at the same time, led to the 19th century people widely adopting the naturalistic worldview in the intellectual class of Europe. So basically, yeah, like the church, was it really opposed to natural philosophy? Well, no, because actually there was only a handful of Galileo examples, and the cases are complex, and they don't really reveal an opposition to science by the church. There was a huge amount of dedication of church resources to medicine and to universities, as much as was needed to understand things in this world. And that is why we have, 40 lunar craters are named after Jesuits who discovered them, or named after them. And would any of these things like the Vatican Observatory, Pontifical Academy for the Sciences, and University of Bologna, of Paris, of Oxford, would these things exist if the church was hostile towards science, towards natural philosophy, for the reason for which that they established these things? So obviously much patronage and infrastructure and systematic dedication to understanding science or natural philosophy, it was required to produce all of these scientific discoveries that were made by early religious researchers in the church. For example, the church they went and took the Aristotelian logical deduction, the works on that, and they applied it to studying nature in the new universities that they built to do that. And that later made the development of the scientific method even possible. And so many significant scientific discoveries were made by Catholics and Christians, especially the clergy. And the evidence for that is seen if you just look through this Wikipedia article called Catholic Clergy Scientists. The page is so long that it's just like it's the longest list that I've ever seen on Wikipedia. It's a very, very long list. A very, very long list of Catholic priests and clergy who were scientists. Like, yeah, I mean, look at that. It's just very long. Okay. So just some food for thought. We as postmodern people, we have inherited so much as our philosophical tradition, but we have no idea what we have inherited at all. And that makes us a very odd generation. Okay, secondly, there's another question for us to think about. Was there a purposeful pushing out into secularism, pushing science out into secularism, so that we could actually achieve rapid scientific advancement? Thirdly, I think it's quite important to consider how important history and philosophy of science is to us, so that it can fill the gaps of our ignorance about our philosophical heritage. and our religious heritage, and understand the legacy of our forefathers. Just where is it that we came from, and why are we what we are like today? Okay, so this is important for us to know. Just because we know more today about subatomic particles than before, we would definitely still not be called guiltless, as in we would be called guilty of being ignorant of the huge inheritances of our philosophical traditions. We are actually a highly knowledgeable blip in regards to science. So we are highly knowledgeable about science. We're a highly knowledgeable blip in regards to knowing about science, but this blip that is entirely ignorant of the enormity of history that makes up our postmodern context, the hundreds of years and thousands of years actually that make up our postmodern context today. So really what I mean is look at this enormous amount of history that led to our postmodern thinking today. That our forefathers from the scientific revolution, the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment and the 19th century adopted in terms of naturalism, making our religious context today. How tiny a blip are we, fully knowledgeable about physical science, but unaware of the 500-year period leading up to how we think of the world today, and how we don't know that that our religion is naturalism. And what's the reason that our society is unaware of these things? It's actually quite important for us to know that we actually prescribe to this religion of naturalism a lot in this world today, and that came from somewhere. It came from Hobbes and Hume and the French naturalists, and also the simultaneous knowledge of science, of the physical world, leading to the adoption by the 19th century our forefathers, of naturalism.